Open your kitchen drawer right now. Pull out a knife. Feel how heavy it is, how cold the metal feels against your hand, how the edge holds its shape no matter how many times you use it. Now, look around your house. The nails inside your walls, the pipes carrying your water, the frame of your car parked outside. All of it is made from the same metal, iron. But to your ancestors, this metal did not exist. Not because they didn't want it. They had no idea it was even possible to make. For almost the entire time humans have walked this earth, iron simply was not something a person could get their hands on. So how did we go from a world with no iron at all to a world completely built out of it? The answer is stranger than you think, and it starts with something that should not have been possible. Long before anyone knew how to pull iron out of rock, people were already wearing it. Iron jewelry, sitting in graves thousands of years older than the very first furnace, which means somebody was already holding iron in their hands, centuries before humans had any way to make it. Here is how we know. In 1911, archaeologists digging at a burial site called Gerza in northern Egypt pulled 9 small beads out of 2 graves. Tiny things, barely bigger than a grain of rice, strung onto a necklace next to gold and a blue stone called lapis lazuli. For decades, nobody was completely sure what these beads actually were. Then, in 2013, a researcher named Thilo Raren, working out of University College London, ran a new kind of test on them. He used neutron beams and X-rays, methods gentle enough not to destroy the tiny corroded beads, and found something remarkable. The metal was packed with nickel, cobalt, and a rare element called germanium, in amounts that almost never occur in iron pulled from the ground. But they occur constantly in one specific place: meteorites. These beads were dated to roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era. That is nearly 2,000 years before anyone on Earth figured out how to smelt iron from ore. And somebody had already hammered this metal into thin sheets, cooled it slowly so it would not crack, and rolled it into tiny tubes to wear as jewelry. They did not mine this iron. They did not dig for it. It fell out of the sky, and they picked it up. It gets stranger. In 1925, archaeologists opened the tomb of a teenage pharaoh named Tutankhamun and found a dagger resting near his body, its blade still sharp, still barely rusted after more than 3,000 years. For decades, people argued about where the metal came from. Then, in 2016, a research team led by Daniela Comelli used a handheld X-ray device right there in the museum, without cutting into the blade at all, and measured its nickel and cobalt content. The numbers matched a meteorite almost perfectly. One of the most famous weapons in ancient Egypt was built from a rock that fell from space. So, for thousands of years, humans were using iron, just not the kind you are picturing. Meteoric iron does not need a furnace. You do not need to separate it from anything. It already arrives as workable metal, just badly shaped, and dense enough to feel completely unlike any other rock lying on the ground. If you found a chunk of it, you would know immediately that it was something different. Something worth keeping, which explains why ancient people treated it as treasure rather than tool. It was rare. It was strange. It fell from the heavens, quite literally. And ancient cultures across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Iran all seemed to sense that this metal was something else entirely. But a necklace bead is not a sword. A dagger blade is not a plow. For iron to actually change the world, someone needed to figure out how to make it from ordinary rock, the kind sitting under almost every patch of ground on the planet. And this is where the story gets genuinely difficult, because pulling iron out of ore turned out to be one of the hardest technical problems ancient humans ever solved. Here's the part most people get backwards. Iron ore is everywhere. It is far more common in the Earth's crust than the copper and tin that go into bronze, and tin especially was maddeningly rare, often traded across thousands of miles just to keep bronze production going at all. If early humans were simply looking for the most abundant, most convenient metal sitting under their feet, iron should have come first by a wide margin. It did not. Bronze had already been mastered for well over 1,000 years before anyone figured out how to smelt iron in any reliable way. The reason comes down to one simple fact of physics. Bronze melts at around 1,000 degrees Celsius. A skilled Bronze Age craftsperson could hit that temperature in a fairly simple clay furnace with a good fire and some patience. Iron does not fully melt until around 1,530 degrees Celsius, a temperature that ancient furnace technology could not reliably reach for thousands of years. So, early metal workers could not simply melt iron ore and pour it into a mold the way they poured bronze. Instead, they had to invent something else entirely, a process called bloomery smelting. You pack iron ore and charcoal together inside a small clay furnace, then force air into it, usually with a bellows, hot enough to chemically strip the oxygen out of the ore without ever fully melting the iron itself. What comes out is not liquid metal. It is a lumpy, spongy mass called a bloom, half iron and half leftover rock and ash called slag. To make that bloom useful, someone then has to reheat it and hammer it over and over, forcing the slag out and compacting the iron into something solid enough to shape into a blade or a tool. This is not casting. This is not something you stumble into by accident while making bronze. It requires a completely different furnace design, a completely different process, and a level of trial and error that likely took generations to work out. Picture the actual work for a moment, because the difficulty is easy to say and hard to feel. A bloomery furnace of this era stood roughly as tall as a person's waist, built from clay and stacked stone, with a narrow shaft at the center. Someone had to keep a bellows pumping for hours at a stretch, by hand, feeding a fire hot enough to glow white at its core, all while the ore and charcoal slowly reacted in a process nobody could actually see happening inside the furnace wall. There were no thermometers, no way to check progress except by watching the smoke and the color of the coals and guessing. If the fire ran too cool for too long, nothing useful formed at all, and an entire day's charcoal was wasted. If it ran a little too hot, the iron could pick up carbon unevenly and turn brittle in ways nobody yet understood how to predict or fix. And even when everything went right, the reward was not a sword. It was an ugly fist-sized lump that then had to be beaten with a hammer for hours, reheated again and again, just to squeeze out enough leftover rock and ash to leave something worth shaping at all. Getting from ore in the ground to a single usable blade could take days of continuous, exhausting labor, and a single miscalculation anywhere along the way meant starting completely over. It is no wonder this technology spread slowly. It is more surprising that anyone worked it out in the first place. Which brings us to one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. Sometime around 50 years before the Common Era, a Hittite king named Hattusili III received a request from a neighboring Assyrian king. He wanted iron, not a trinket, an actual shipment. And Hattusili wrote back with an excuse that historians still quote today. He said that good iron was not currently available in his storehouse, that production was going badly at the moment, and that he would send it once his workers had finished making more. In the meantime, he sent an iron dagger blade as a placeholder gift. Think about what that letter actually reveals. This was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient Near East, and its king still could not simply hand over iron on demand. Production was slow, supply was limited, and the fact that he stalled at all suggests something else, something political. Iron was not just difficult to make. It may have been a guarded secret, a strategic resource the Hittites had no interest in handing to a rival kingdom, even one powerful enough to ask directly. For a long time, this letter got folded into a popular myth, the idea that the Hittites built an empire on secret iron weapons that made them unbeatable in battle, cutting through enemy bronze swords like paper. It is a great story. It is also, according to most historians who study this period closely, probably not true. Iron in this era, before anyone had figured out how to deliberately add carbon to it through a process called carburization, and long before anyone understood how to quench and temper it into true steel, was not actually harder than well-made bronze. Early smelted iron was often softer, more brittle, and less reliable than the bronze weapons armies had already been perfecting for centuries. Archaeological digs at a site in central Anatolia called Kale have turned up some of the earliest known evidence of experimental iron smelting, including tiny fragments that show inconsistent carbon content, evidence that ancient smiths were stumbling towards steel without fully understanding what they were doing or how to repeat it reliably. The Hittites were not fielding armies of invincible iron soldiers. They were sitting on a rare, difficult, unreliable material that happened to be valuable specifically because almost nobody else could make it yet. So if the secret was not superior weapons, why guard it at all? Possibly prestige. Possibly the simple economics of scarcity, the same instinct that makes any hard-to-produce material valuable regardless of whether it outperforms the alternative. Either way, for centuries, iron stayed a luxury item, gifted between kings, buried with royalty, mentioned in letters instead of showing up by the thousands in ordinary graves. Now here is a question that deserves real attention, because it complicates the entire story in an important way. Did the technique for smelting iron spread outward from one single place, the way many historians once assumed, starting somewhere near Anatolia and traveling east and west along old trade routes? Or did people in completely different parts of the world figure out the same difficult trick independently, without ever meeting each other? The evidence increasingly points toward the second answer, at least in part. In the region that is now Niger, in West Africa, a French archaeologist named Gérard Quéchon uncovered smelting sites in an area called the Termit Massif, with radiocarbon dates stretching back to somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, timing that lines up with or even predates some of the Near Eastern evidence. Further south, at a site called Leja in southeastern Nigeria, researchers have found over 800 large blocks of iron slag, and some radiocarbon results, though still debated among archaeologists, have pushed proposed dates even earlier. Historians studying this question, including Roland Oliver and the Belgian scholar Jan van Sina, have argued that iron smelting likely emerged independently in more than one place in Africa, at sites separated by enormous distances, using furnace designs different enough from each other that a single shared origin seems unlikely. If they are right, then the leap from meteoric scraps to true smelting was not one lightning strike of genius that spread outward like ripples in a pond. It was a difficult technical problem that more than one group of humans, working in isolation from each other, eventually solved on their own. Whichever version is true, once the technique existed anywhere, it did not stay rare for long. And this is where iron stopped being a curiosity and started rewriting the world. Around 1100 years before the Common Era, the great Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire among them, collapsed within the space of a few generations. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected kingdoms across thousands of miles simply stopped functioning. Historians still argue over exactly why. Drought, famine, internal rebellion, and the mysterious raiders known only as the Sea Peoples all likely played some part, and probably not just one of them acting alone. But the timing lines up with something else. As the old bronze trade networks broke down, supplies of tin, one of the two metals bronze absolutely requires, became harder to reach. Iron ore, meanwhile, needed no long trade route at all. It was sitting in the ground almost everywhere. So as bronze became harder to source, iron stopped being a rare gift for kings and slowly became the metal ordinary blacksmiths could actually get their hands on and work with regularly. Not because iron had suddenly proven itself superior, because the alternative had become unreliable, and iron had spent centuries quietly waiting for its moment. Once smiths finally cracked the process of adding carbon into the iron on purpose, and learned to heat and cool it in ways that made it genuinely harder than bronze, iron stopped being a backup plan. It became the material of a new age, farming tools that lasted longer, axles and nails and tools cheap enough for ordinary households, not just palaces, weapons that could finally outperform the metal they replaced. And it never stopped. The rails that carried the industrial world forward were iron. The engines that ran on those rails were built from it too. The frame of nearly every skyscraper on Earth today is built from steel, which is nothing more than iron with a carefully controlled amount of carbon added. The exact trick ancient smiths were fumbling toward by accident 3,000 years ago, only now controlled down to the exact percentage in a laboratory, instead of guessed at by watching the color of a coal fire. The bridge you drove over this week, the washing machine in your home, the screws holding together the chair you are sitting in right now, the surgical tools a doctor used the last time you were in a hospital. Almost none of it would exist without that same basic idea: iron with the right amount of carbon, heated and cooled in the right way. Even the phone in your pocket, for all its glass and silicon, almost certainly has steel somewhere inside its frame, holding the delicate parts in place. The knife in your kitchen drawer, the one you pulled out at the very start of this, is the direct descendant of a lump of ugly, spongy metal that someone hammered by a fire so long ago that we do not even know their name, in a place we cannot pinpoint, using a method they almost certainly discovered through failure after failure after failure. So here is where we end up. The very first iron any human being ever touched did not come from patient invention at all. It fell out of the sky, and somebody was simply lucky enough to be standing there when it landed, curious enough to pick it up, and clever enough to realize it was worth keeping. Everything after that, the furnaces, the failed batches, the secret letters between kings, the centuries of hammering and reheating and hammering again in more than one corner of the world at once, was humanity slowly teaching itself to manufacture the thing the universe had once handed us for free. We spent thousands of years chasing a metal we could not make, failing, adjusting, failing again, until the day we finally could. And once we could, we never stopped. Put that knife back in the drawer. It has been with us, in one form or another, for over 5,000 years, and it is not going anywhere.